The Galactic Academy's Ice Maze Challenge had a reputation that stretched across 17 star systems, and none of it was good. It was the kind of test that made grown Zephyrians weep crystalline tears, and sent molten worlders scrambling for the nearest heated transport pod. The mortality rate wasn't technically zero, but only because the Academy's legal department had gotten very creative with their definitions of alive and functional. Jake Morrison stood in the prep chamber, watching his classmates gear up like they were about to storm a fortress made of frozen death. Which, to be fair, wasn't entirely inaccurate. "Human Jake," rumbled Vex, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 conquered worlds, and the subtle undertone of someone who'd never met a problem he couldn't punch. The Krathari warrior was busy strapping on what looked like enough thermal gear to outfit a small Arctic expedition. His species had evolved on a planet where the average temperature could melt copper, so naturally, he approached cold weather with all the enthusiasm of a vampire facing a sunrise. "You realize this test was designed to eliminate the weak, yes?" "Gee, thanks for the pep talk, Vex," Jake replied, pulling on what his alien classmates probably thought was pathetically inadequate clothing. A simple thermal shirt, some waterproof pants, and boots that had seen better decades. "Really feeling the team spirit here." Quilm, the crystalline collective's star pupil, chimed in with the musical tones that passed for speech among his kind. His body literally sparkled as he spoke, each word creating tiny light refractions through his translucent form. "Statistically speaking, Jake Morrison, your species lacks the necessary physiological adaptations for sub-zero survival. Your body temperature regulation is primitive at best, and your skin offers virtually no protection against thermal loss." "Wow," Jake said, checking the laces on his boots. "Did you just call me a walking meat popsicle in the nicest possible way?" The third member of their unlikely quartet, Boom, was having his own crisis. The gaseous being was currently contained in what looked like a high-tech fishbowl with legs, his normal cloud-like form swirling anxiously inside the environmental suit. "This is madness," he wheezed through his translator. "My people are not meant for solid-state temperatures. I could literally freeze into something resembling your primitive ice cubes." "At least you'd be useful at parties," Jake offered helpfully. The prep chamber fell silent except for the ominous humming of the climate control systems gearing up for what could generously be called Arctic nightmare mode. Through the reinforced viewing window, they could see the maze itself, a twisted labyrinth of ice walls that seemed to absorb light and hope in equal measure. The temperature readings on the wall display made Jake think of home, specifically the time his dad had made him shovel the driveway during that blizzard in February. "Attention test subjects," Professor Krendak's voice crackled through the intercom with all the warmth of the vacuum of space. "You have 30 minutes to complete the maze or forfeit your passing grade for advanced survival techniques. The temperature has been set to -40 degrees Celsius to simulate the harshest conditions your respective species might encounter in deep space exploration." Jake glanced at the temperature reading and shrugged. "Not bad. Could be Minnesota." His classmates stared at him like he'd just announced his intention to juggle antimatter. "What?" Vex growled. "Is a Minnesota." Professor Krendak materialized in the prep chamber, his holographic form flickering with the kind of bureaucratic authority that made students across the galaxy break out in stress rashes. He was a Vorthan, which meant he looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a tax auditor and given the result a really bad attitude about tardiness. "The Ice Maze Challenge," he began, his synthesized voice carrying all the emotional warmth of a funeral dirge, "has been carefully designed to test your survival instincts under extreme thermal duress. The maze itself adapts, creating new pathways and obstacles as you progress. Ice walls will shift, temperatures will fluctuate, and various hazards will test your species' natural advantages." Vex puffed out his chest, which was impressive considering his chest could probably be used as a landing pad for small aircraft. "My people conquered the frozen moons of Arcturus. A little ice maze will not defeat a warrior of the Krathari." "Adorable," Jake muttered, earning himself a glare that could have melted steel, or would have if Vex weren't currently wrapped in enough thermal gear to survive a trip to Pluto. Professor Krendak continued his death by PowerPoint presentation. "Vex, your species' enhanced muscular density and thermal generation should allow you to power through most obstacles. Quilm, your crystalline matrix can refract and focus ambient energy to maintain core temperature. And Boom," he paused, looking at the gas creature with something approaching pity, "your molecular dispersion abilities should theoretically allow you to flow around obstacles." "Theoretically," Boom wheezed nervously. "And Jake," the professor's holographic eyes fixed on the human with the kind of look usually reserved for finding gum on your shoe, "your species will serve as an interesting control group for the effects of the maze on completely unspecialized life forms." "Gee, thanks," Nothing says confidence like being called the control group. Quillen's crystalline form sparkled with what Jake had learned to recognize as smugness. Perhaps, Jake Morrison, you should observe our techniques carefully. Your survival may depend on learning from species who have actually evolved beyond the primitive stage. Oh, absolutely. Jake nodded seriously. I'm just a poor, unspecialized human. No natural advantages whatsoever. Just soft, squishy meat that definitely didn't evolve anywhere with cold weather. Vex leaned over, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a helpful whisper but actually sounded like a landslide with good intentions. Human Jake. When the cold begins to affect your inferior circulation, do not panic. Panic leads to faster heat loss. Instead, try to find shelter behind one of us superior beings. Superior beings, Jake repeated thoughtfully. Right. Hey, quick question. What's the average temperature on Krathar? A comfortable 47 degrees Celsius, Vex replied proudly. Perfect for maintaining optimal muscle function. And why do you ask? Oh, no reason, Jake said, glancing again at the temperature reading that still reminded him of a particularly mild day back home. Just wondering what superior means in this context. Professor Krendak cleared his throat, a sound like grinding machinery. You have 5 minutes to complete final preparations. Remember, this test has eliminated students from 12 different species over the past decade. Do not underestimate the challenge ahead. As the hologram flickered out, Jake looked around at his heavily bundled classmates, each one loaded down with enough survival gear to establish a small research station. So, he said conversationally, anyone want to guess where Minnesota is? The maze entrance yawned before them like the mouth of some cosmic refrigerator that had been left open since the heat death of the universe. Ice crystals hung in the air like frozen glitter, and the temperature gauge on Jake's wrist cheerfully informed him that they were now at a balmy -38 Celsius and dropping. I shall demonstrate proper technique, Vex announced, his voice muffled by the thermal face mask that made him look like a very angry, very large Arctic explorer. Watch and learn, inferior beings. With all the subtlety of a meteor strike, Vex charged into the maze. His strategy appeared to be intimidate the ice into submission, which might have worked if ice had any concept of fear. For the first 30 seconds it looked like it might actually work. His massive form barreled through the entrance corridor, his heated suit pumping out enough thermal energy to power a small space station. Then physics decided to have a chat. Vex, Quillen called out as the warriors' triumphant battle roars suddenly went quiet. Are you progressing adequately? A muffled grunt echoed from somewhere inside the maze, followed by what sounded like someone trying to move furniture made of concrete. My joints, came Vex's voice, now notably less confident, appear to be experiencing some resistance. Jake peered around the entrance corner and bit back a laugh. The mighty Krathari warrior was stuck in what could generously be called a heroic pose, and more accurately described as statue of confused person trying to take a step. His suit's heating system was working overtime, but it turned out that keeping a 47-degree creature warm at -40 was like trying to heat a warehouse with a birthday candle. The lubricating fluids in my knee joints, Vex continued, his voice taking on a distinctly panicked edge, seemed to have achieved a more solid state. You mean they froze? Jake called out helpfully. Krathari joint fluid does not freeze, Vex protested with the dignity of someone who was very much stuck in place. It simply becomes temporarily viscous. Very temporarily. Any moment now. 5 minutes later, Vex was still demonstrating his impression of a very large, very annoyed ice sculpture. Perhaps, Quillen suggested, his crystalline form practically vibrating with intellectual excitement, a more logical approach is required. Observe as I apply systematic problem solving to this challenge. Unlike Vex's brute force approach, Quillen glided into the maze with the serene confidence of someone who had calculated every possible angle. His crystalline body caught and refracted the dim light beautifully, creating rainbow patterns on the ice walls as he moved with mathematical precision through the corridors. You see, he called back to his audience, by analyzing the thermal dynamics and structural integrity of each pathway, I can determine the optimal route with minimal energy expenditure and maximum. There was a sound like a wine glass being tapped with a fork, followed by several more similar sounds in rapid succession. Quillen, Jake called out. You okay in there? I am experiencing some unexpected crystalline resonance, came the reply, though Quillen's normally melodious voice now sounded like a wind chime in a hurricane. It appears that my refractive matrix is becoming somewhat brittle in these temperatures. Jake ventured a little further into the maze and found Quillen frozen in place, but not in the same way as Vex. The crystalline being was literally starting to crack, tiny fracture lines spreading across his normally perfect surface like a windshield after a particularly aggressive encounter with a rock. I have calculated 17 different solutions to proceed, Quillen announced, though he didn't move. However, all of them require me to move, and movement currently seems inadvisable given my structural integrity. So you're stuck too. I prefer the term temporarily optimizing my position for maximum stability, Quillen replied with wounded dignity. Right. Jake nodded. Boom. Want to give it a shot? Boom's environmental suit was already fogging up with condensation, and the gaseous being inside was swirling around like a very anxious tornado in a jar. This is a terrible idea, he wheezed. My molecular cohesion is already showing signs of thermal stress. But peer pressure was apparently universal, because Boom entered the maze with all the enthusiasm of someone walking to their own execution. His plan seemed to be to flow around obstacles in his gaseous form, which would have been brilliant if gas laws hadn't been invented. The sound that emerged from the maze 30 seconds later was like someone slowly deflating a balloon filled with despair. Jake found Boom's environmental suit sitting sadly in the first turn of the maze, its occupant now reduced to what looked like a very depressed puddle of liquid at the bottom of the container. I appear to have undergone an involuntary phase transition, came Boom's voice from the suit's speakers, though it now sounded like someone talking through a mouthful of water. My gaseous form has condensed into what I believe your species would call it really sad soup. Jake looked back toward the entrance where Professor Krendek's hologram had reappeared, probably to witness what he assumed would be the swift elimination of the human student. Well, Jake said, cracking his knuckles and looking at the maze that had just defeated 3 supposedly superior species. Guess it's my turn. Behind him, Vex was still frozen mid-stride. Quillen was developing more cracks than a sidewalk in an earthquake, and Boom was learning firsthand why gas heating bills were so expensive in winter. Human Jake, Vex managed to call out, his voice stiff with more than just cold. Perhaps you should wait for rescue services. Jake looked at the temperature gauge on his wrist. -42, and still dropping. Nah, he said, pulling off his outer jacket and leaving it by the entrance. I think I'll be fine. Professor Krendek's holographic form flickered with what might have been confusion, or possibly a technical malfunction. It was hard to tell with Vorthens. Student Morrison, I must advise you that removing thermal protection in sub-zero conditions is considered inadvisable by, well, everyone. Thanks for the tip, Jake replied, rolling up his sleeves like he was about to wash dishes rather than enter what had just become a triple alien disaster zone. The temperature had now dropped to a crisp -45°C, and Jake's breath came out in puffs that immediately crystallized and fell to the ground like tiny snow globes. He stepped into the maze entrance, and immediately something wonderful happened. His feet found purchase on the ice like he'd been born to it. Where Vex had tried to power through and gotten stuck, where Quillen had attempted to calculate his way around obstacles, Jake simply flowed. Oh come on, he muttered, a grin spreading across his face as he pushed off from the entrance wall and let momentum carry him into the first turn. This is just hockey without the puck. Behind him, he could hear Professor Krendek's increasingly frantic commentary. Student Morrison appears to be sliding. This was not anticipated in our behavioral models. Jake hit the first major obstacle, a section where the maze narrowed and ice spikes jutted from both walls like frozen spears. Vex had probably planned to punch through them. Quillen had likely calculated the precise angles needed to squeeze between them. Jake took one look at the setup and laughed. Ice level baby, he said, dropping into a crouch and using his forward momentum to slide under the lowest spike like he was stealing second base. The ice was smooth as glass, and Jake's boots had just enough tread to let him control his direction without losing speed. He could hear Boom's liquid voice gurgling from his environmental suit. How is he moving so efficiently? Impossible, came Quillen's crackling response. His species lacks any specialized ice traversal adaptations. This should not be occurring. Jake banked off the next wall like he was in a luge run, using the ice's natural properties to redirect his momentum around a sharp corner. The maze had been designed to be treacherous, with slippery surfaces and unstable footing. To Jake it felt like someone had built him a personal amusement park. Woo, he called out, unable to contain his enthusiasm as he hit a straight section and really let himself go. He was skating now, Long, smooth strides that ate up distance while barely expending energy. This is better than the rink back home. The maze tried to adapt, creating new obstacles and shifting walls, but every change just gave Jake new opportunities. When a wall suddenly jutted out to block his path, he used it as a jump to launch himself over a pit that opened up beneath him. When the floor became covered in loose ice crystals, he used them like ball bearings to slide even faster. Student Morrison, Professor Krendak's voice had taken on a distinctly strained quality. You appear to be treating a deadly survival challenge as some form of recreational activity. Best workout I've had all semester, Jake called back, navigating a section with moving ice platforms by hopping from one to another like he was playing the galaxy's most expensive game of hopscotch. He could hear his classmates' increasingly bewildered commentary, echoing through the maze's acoustic system. His core temperature should be dropping, Quillen was saying, his voice now sounding like gravel in a blender. Why is his core temperature not dropping? Maybe, Vex suggested with the kind of desperate hope usually reserved for people checking lottery numbers. The human is secretly wearing advanced thermal regulation technology. Jake looked down at his simple t-shirt, now slightly damp with sweat from the exertion, and snorted. Yeah, it's called a functioning circulatory system, and a metabolism that isn't designed for living on the surface of Mercury. The final section of the maze was clearly meant to be the ultimate challenge. The temperature dropped to -50, the walls were covered in razor-sharp ice formations, and the floor was a sheet of black ice so smooth it was basically a mirror. It was the kind of terrain that would send an Olympic figure skater running for the safety net. Jake took one look at it, and whooped with joy. Now this is what I'm talking about. He hit the black ice section like he'd been shot from a cannon, using tiny shifts in weight and pressure to carve turns that would have made a professional speed skater weep with envy. The razor ice formations became slalom markers, and Jake wove between them with the kind of casual grace that suggested he did this sort of thing every weekend. Which, to be fair, he kind of did. The maze exit appeared ahead, and Jake realized he had a choice. He could slow down, walk through the exit with dignity, and pretend this had been difficult. Or, he hit the final straight section at full speed, dropped into a perfect hockey stop that sent up a spray of ice crystals like confetti, and slid sideways through the exit with his arms raised in victory. Time, he announced cheerfully, checking his watch. 12 minutes 37 seconds. Not bad for a warm-up. The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for libraries, funeral homes, and the moment when people realize they've been completely and utterly wrong about everything. Professor Krendak's hologram flickered rapidly, as if his programming was having difficulty processing what had just occurred. That, Jake said, brushing ice crystals off his shirt, was actually kind of fun. Hey, does the maze have different difficulty settings? Because I'm thinking that was maybe set to beginner mode. The silence stretched on like a really awkward dinner party where someone had just announced they were dating their cousin. Professor Krendak's hologram was cycling through what appeared to be every expression in the Vorthan emotional database, settling somewhere between existential crisis and software malfunction. Beginner mode, the professor repeated slowly, as if the words were in a language he'd never heard before. Student Morrison, that maze was calibrated to challenge the most advanced survival specialists in the galaxy. Huh, Jake said, genuinely surprised. Weird. So where I come from, we call that Tuesday afternoon at the community center. From inside the maze came the sound of Vex trying to chip himself free with what sounded like a thermal cutter. This is impossible, his muffled voice declared. No species should find sub-zero navigation trivial. It violates the basic principles of galactic biology. Jake looked back at his classmates, still trapped in various states of thermal disaster, and something clicked. Oh, he said, his expression shifting from casual amusement to dawning realization. Oh, you guys actually don't know, do you? Know what? Quill managed to ask, though his voice now sounded like someone gargling with broken glass. Jake sat down on a convenient ice block, apparently immune to the fact that it was cold enough to flash freeze most known life forms. Okay, so here's the thing about humans. We're not actually from a nice warm stable planet where everything stays the same temperature year-round. Professor Krendak's hologram leaned forward with the intensity of someone who was about to have their entire worldview reconstructed. Continue. Earth, Jake began, settling in like he was about to tell a campfire story, goes through these things called seasons. But that's not the fun part. The fun part is that every few thousand years we get these extended periods called ice ages, where pretty much the entire planet turns into exactly what you just watched me play around in. The silence was so complete that Jake could hear Boom's liquid form sloshing nervously in his environmental suit. Ice ages, Jake continued, warming to his theme, last for thousands of years, and humans, being the stubborn adaptable little primates we are, didn't just survive them, we thrived in them. We invented hockey. We invented skiing. We invented the phrase, hold my beer, and watch this specifically for ice-related activities. Vex's voice came from the maze, strained with effort and growing realization. You're saying your species evolved specifically for frozen environments. Not just evolved for them, Jake grinned. We turned them into entertainment. Do you know what humans do when we find a perfectly good mountain covered in frozen water? We strap pieces of wood to our feet and throw ourselves down it at 60 miles per hour. For fun. Professor Krendak's hologram flickered rapidly. This changes everything. Our entire assessment of human physical capabilities was based on your performance in standard temperature environments. Oh, it gets better, Jake said, standing up and starting to pace, his feet finding perfect grip on surfaces that had defeated 3 supposedly superior species. See, that maze wasn't just cold, it was slippery, right? Ice physics. And humans spent thousands of years figuring out how to move on ice. We developed entire sports around it. We have something called figure skating, where people do pirouettes and jumps on frozen water while wearing knife shoes, and we consider it art. Quillen's crystalline form was developing more fracture lines by the minute, but his voice carried the horrified fascination of an academic realizing his thesis was completely wrong. The sliding locomotion you demonstrated, this is standard human mobility in frozen conditions. Standard. Jake laughed. Dude, I'm mediocre at best. You should see what humans who are actually good at ice sports can do. There are people on my planet who can slide down mountains of ice on 2 thin strips of metal while navigating around trees at speeds that would make your head spin. And they do it recreationally. From the maze came the sound of Vex finally breaking free from his icy prison, followed immediately by the sound of him falling over because his joints still weren't working properly. But your thermal regulation, Professor Krendak protested, his academic worldview crumbling in real time. Your species lacks natural insulation, specialized circulation systems or metabolic heat generation. Jake pulled off his t-shirt, revealing skin that was slightly pink from exertion but showed no signs of hypothermia. We have something better. We have behavioral adaptation and really good circulation. Plus, when you spend half your evolutionary history chasing mammoths across frozen tundra, you develop some pretty solid cold weather reflexes. Mammoths. Boom gurgled from his liquid state. Giant furry elephants, Jake explained helpfully. We used to hunt them by running them off cliffs, in blizzards, because apparently my ancestors thought regular hunting was too easy. The implications were sinking in across the board. Professor Krendak's hologram was now cycling through expressions so rapidly it looked like someone was flipping through channels. The test, the professor said slowly, was designed to simulate the most extreme cold weather conditions any species might encounter in deep space exploration. Right. Jake nodded. Conditions that we assumed would challenge even the most adapted species to their absolute limits. Conditions that you just described as recreational activity. Pretty much, yeah. There was a long pause while everyone processed this information. Student Morrison, Professor Krendak said finally, his voice carrying the kind of careful precision used by people who are trying very hard not to have a complete mental breakdown. Would you be willing to provide instruction to your classmates on basic ice survival techniques? Jake looked back into the maze, where Vex was attempting to walk and failing spectacularly. Quillen looked like a cracked windshield having an anxiety attack, and Boom was learning the hard way why the phrase liquid courage didn't apply to actual liquid states. Sure, he said cheerfully. First lesson is free. Rule number 1, don't lick anything metal. From inside the maze came the immediate sound of Vex yelping and what could only be described as someone trying to unstick their tongue from something very cold. Too late, Jake sighed. Okay, rule number 2, when I say don't lick the metal, that includes your thermal suit's exterior components. 3 hours later, the prep chamber had been converted into what could generously be called Ice Survival 101 Remedial Edition for Advanced Species. Jake had somehow acquired a whiteboard, several markers, and the kind of patient expression usually seen on kindergarten teachers during the first week of school. Okay, let's try this again, Jake said, pointing to a crude drawing of a stick figure on ice. When you encounter a slippery surface, you don't fight the slipperiness, you work with it. Vex, what did we learn about trying to power through ice physics? Vex, now freed from the maze, but moving like a robot with low battery, raised his hand with the enthusiasm of someone who had recently discovered that physics was not in fact optional. That the ice does not care about my warrior heritage, or my ability to bench press a small spacecraft. Excellent. And Quillen? the crystalline being, was now held together with what appeared to be high-tech duct tape and sheer determination. His voice came out in carefully modulated tones, as if speaking too quickly might cause him to shatter completely. That calculating the optimal path means nothing if one's structural integrity fails before reaching the destination. Very good. Boom. There was a sad gurgling sound from the environmental suit, where Boom was slowly transitioning back to his gaseous state, but still resembled something like cosmic soup. That phase transitions are not always voluntary, and condensation is the enemy of dignity. Perfect. Jake beamed like a proud teacher. Now who can tell me why humans don't freeze solid the moment we step outside in winter? 3 alien hands shot up with the desperate eagerness of students who had recently learned that their entire understanding of biology was incomplete. Ooh. Quilm practically vibrated, his repairs making small clicking sounds. Behavioral adaptation combined with superior circulation systems evolved over millions of years of Ice Age survival. Close, but you're overthinking it, Jake said. Vex. Because humans are secretly terrifying and chose to live in conditions that would kill most sensible species, Vex offered hopefully. Getting warmer. Boom. Because humans are the weird ones, and everyone else in the galaxy is normal. Came the slightly less liquid response. Jake considered this. You know what? That's actually not wrong. We are the weird ones. Most species in the galaxy evolved on nice stable planets with reasonable climates. Humans evolved on a planet that regularly tries to kill everything on it, and our response was to invent sports about it. Professor Krendak, who had been silent for the past hour while presumably running diagnostics on his entire educational database, finally spoke up. Student Morrison, I have received word from the Academy administration. They are interested in your performance today. Oh great, Jake muttered. Did I break something? On the contrary. They want to hire you as a consultant for their extreme environment training program. Apparently, several other species have been struggling with what they call frozen water hazard scenarios in deep space exploration. Jake blinked. They want to hire me to teach aliens how to walk on ice, among other things. Yes, the Galactic Exploration Council has identified 17 different scenarios where humans' unusual cold weather adaptations could prove invaluable to mixed species crews. Huh, Jake said, looking around at his classmates who were all nodding enthusiastically. That's actually pretty cool. No pun intended. Vex struggled to his feet, his movements still resembling someone who had recently been flash frozen and wasn't entirely sure all his parts were working correctly. Human Jake, I owe you an apology. I called your species inferior, when clearly you are simply adapted for conditions that would destroy most civilized beings. Well, when you put it like that, we sound kind of awesome. Jake grinned. Quilm, despite being held together with tape and prayer, managed to sparkle with what might have been admiration. Your species' ability to find recreational value in lethal environmental conditions is both fascinating and deeply concerning from a psychological standpoint. Thanks, I think. Boom had finally managed to return to something resembling his normal gaseous state, though he still looked a bit like a cloud having an existential crisis. I have learned today that there are fates worse than death, and one of them is being liquid when you are supposed to be gas. That's very philosophical. Boom. Professor Krendak cleared his holographic throat. There is one more thing, Student Morrison. The Academy has decided to redesign the Ice Maze Challenge. Jake felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. Please tell me you're not making it harder. Quite the opposite. We're making it easier. Apparently, having a test that one species finds relaxing while it traumatizes everyone else is considered poor educational design. So what's the new test going to be? Professor Krendak's hologram flickered with what might have been amusement. We're calling it the Desert Survival Challenge. Extreme heat, sand navigation, minimal water availability. Jake, Vex, Quilm and Boom all looked at each other with sudden understanding. Dibs on not going first, Jake said quickly. Agreed, said Vex, Quilm and Boom in unison. Although, Jake added thoughtfully, I should probably mention that humans also lived in deserts for thousands of years, and we invented something called sandboarding where we surfed down sand dunes for fun. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Professor Krendak's hologram powering down entirely, apparently unable to process any more revelations about human recreational activities. You know what? Vex said finally, looking at Jake with a mixture of respect and terror. I think I'm beginning to understand why the rest of the galaxy finds humans so unsettling. Because we're adaptable. Because you people take things that should kill you and turn them into weekend activities. Quilm added, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just solved a particularly disturbing puzzle. Jake shrugged. What can I say? We get bored easily. Boom floated thoughtfully in his environmental suit. I have decided that humans are either the most impressive species in the galaxy or completely insane. Why not both? Jake asked cheerfully. And somewhere in the Academy's administrative offices, a dozen bureaucrats were frantically redesigning curriculum, while muttering things like of course they invented ice dancing, and why didn't anyone tell us about hockey, and what do you mean they have something called polar bear swimming? But that's a story for another day.